are. The administration is trying to sell their military kill campaign by saying they're targeting drug traffickers who are selling fentanyl and hurting Americans. Fact: fentanyl and fentanyl precursors do not come to the United States through Caribbean sea routes. Fact: the drug boats that the administration are blowing up are mostly carrying cocaine to Europe. Fact: President Trump just pardoned known Honduran cocaine kingpin. Fact: most smugglers that bring drugs into the country are U.S. citizens. Fact: the real national security threat is selling our AI chips to China, not blowing up fishermen. American taxpayers are spending millions of dollars to stop the Europeans from partying. So what is in it for us? Normalization of extrajudicial killings, a total lack of due process, evidence, or congressional authorization. We need to stop this madness. I authorize.
What you just witnessed in that chamber of horrors masquerading as congressional testimony is nothing less than the complete moral bankruptcy of Trumpian foreign policy laid bare in all its grotesque hypocrisy. And I need you to understand right now that this is not just another routine example of presidential overreach or partisan disagreement, because what Representative Kamlager-Dove just exposed is a systemic assault on the constitutional order wrapped in the most cynical kind of security theater imaginable. And wait until you hear what's actually happening in those Caribbean waters, because the contradictions are so staggering, they would be comedically absurd if they weren't resulting in dozens of extrajudicial killings of human beings who never received a trial, never faced charges, never got to confront their accusers in a court of law. As of December 15, 2025, at least 95 people have been killed in at least 25 strikes on 26 vessels, and every single one of those deaths represents a profound violation of international law and domestic constitutional constraints on executive power. But here's the part that should make your blood absolutely boil, because it reveals the entire operation as a performative charade, designed to satisfy Trump's authoritarian impulses while doing precisely nothing to address the drug crisis he claims to be combating. Listen to what the facts actually tell us, and I want you to pay very close attention, because the Trump administration has built its entire justification for these strikes on the claim that they're stopping fentanyl from poisoning Americans, that every boat they blow out of the water saves 25,000 lives, as Trump himself has repeatedly asserted. But here's the problem, and it's not a minor technical detail, it's the entire foundation of their argument, collapsing under the weight of basic empirical reality. According to retired Coast Guard Rear Admiral William Baumgartner, these boats do not carry fentanyl, they are carrying cocaine. And we're not talking about some fringe voice here, we're talking about the former chief counsel to the Coast Guard, who understands maritime drug interdiction better than the political appointees currently orchestrating this military campaign, and the data backs him up completely, because there is no evidence that any significant level of illegal fentanyl is produced in South America, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, with most illegal fentanyl entering the U.S. from Mexico. The geographic reality is inescapable, and it exposes the entire Trump narrative as a calculated deception because fentanyl precursors come from China. The drug is manufactured in Mexico, and it enters the United States primarily through land border crossings, not on speedboats in the Caribbean, which means every time Trump or Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth claims these strikes are saving American lives from fentanyl, they are lying to the American people with a brazenness that would make Richard Nixon blush. But wait, because it gets even more damning when you examine where these boats are actually going and what they're actually carrying, because the intelligence and expert consensus is overwhelming and it completely demolishes the administration's stated rationale. According to Rahul Gupta, who served as director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy in the Biden administration, most of the trafficking boats in the Caribbean are carrying cocaine bound for Europe. And this isn't speculation, this is based on trafficking pattern analysis and seizure data compiled over decades of drug interdiction operations, and the economic incentives make it perfectly clear because a kilogram of cocaine costs about $28,000 in the United States, but the same amount fetches roughly $40,000 on average in Europe, and as much as $80,000 in some European countries. The profit motive for Caribbean routes is European markets, not American ones, and Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela are identified as key departure points for cocaine to Europe, with drugs transported by boats, private yachts, or by air, which means what we're witnessing is the United States military spending millions of dollars in taxpayer money and killing dozens of people to interdict drug shipments that were never destined for American shores in the first place, essentially subsidizing European drug enforcement at the cost of human lives and constitutional norms. And as Kamlager-Dove so brilliantly articulated, we are spending millions of dollars to stop Europeans from partying, while normalizing extrajudicial killings in international waters. Now here's where the hypocrisy reaches levels so extreme that it borders on parody, and I need you to fully grasp the temporal proximity and ideological incoherence of what Trump has done, because while his administration is conducting what it calls a war on narco-terrorism in the Caribbean, President Trump officially pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who U.S. officials said was at the center of one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. Let me repeat that so it sinks in, because the juxtaposition is so staggering it demands repetition. Trump is simultaneously ordering the military to kill alleged drug traffickers without trial in Caribbean waters, while granting a full presidential pardon to a convicted drug kingpin who helped facilitate the importation of an almost unfathomable 400 tons of cocaine to this country, according to U.S. Attorney Damian Williams. And Hernandez wasn't some low-level operator. He was convicted by a jury for conspiring to import over 400 tons of cocaine into the United States in what prosecutors described as state-sponsored drug trafficking involving the abuse of the Honduran military and national police. The man took bribes from Joaquin El Chapo Guzman himself. He used state security forces to protect cocaine shipments, and witness testimony placed him at meetings where he allegedly said, "We're going to shove the drugs right up the noses of the gringos." And Trump looked at this conviction, this mountain of evidence, this jury verdict, and said, actually, this man deserves a full and complete pardon. The message could not be clearer, and it's the message that authoritarians have sent throughout history, which is that law and justice are not principles, they are weapons to be deployed against enemies and privileges to be extended to friends. Senator Tim Kaine pointed to this as proof that Trump cares nothing about narco-trafficking and views the drug war merely as a political tool to be wielded against enemies like Venezuela's Maduro, and suspended for friends like Hernandez. This is the operational logic of a protection racket, not a constitutional republic, because if you move your embassy to Jerusalem as Hernandez did, if you pledge fealty to Trump's geopolitical priorities, if you have Roger Stone lobbying on your behalf, then apparently facilitating the importation of 400 tons of cocaine becomes a forgivable administrative error. But if you're a nameless person on a speedboat in the Caribbean that may or may not be carrying drugs to destinations that may or may not be the United States, then you can be vaporized by a missile strike without any due process whatsoever. Senator Kaine noted evidence of Hernandez's statement about wanting to shove drugs up the nose of gringos and flood the United States with cocaine, calling him the leader of one of the largest criminal enterprises ever subject to conviction in U.S. courts. Yet less than 1 year into his sentence, President Trump pardoned him, suggesting Trump cares nothing about narco-trafficking. Now let's talk about the legal architecture that's supposed to prevent exactly this kind of presidential adventurism, because the framers of the Constitution understood that the war power had to be split between the executive and legislative branches precisely to prevent the kind of unilateral military action we're witnessing right now. The Constitution explicitly grants Congress the sole authority to declare war and make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, while the executive has inherent authority as commander-in-chief. Like as wasn't an accident or an oversight, this was the deliberate design of people who had lived under monarchy and understood that concentrating the power to make war in a single individual was an invitation to tyranny. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was passed specifically to reassert congressional authority after Vietnam, seeking to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostility. Yet Trump has completely bypassed these constraints by the simple expedient of designating criminal organizations as terrorist groups and claiming that the United States is engaged in a non-international armed conflict that doesn't require congressional authorization. This is constitutional chicanery of the highest order, and legal experts across the political spectrum have recognized it as such, because these terrorism designations do not authorize the use of military force overseas according to legal experts. Yet the administration has proceeded anyway, constructing an alternate legal reality inside the executive branch, where whatever questionable attempts the administration is making to provide legal justification for these premeditated killings, in reality the Justice Department opinion serves as a permission slip for broad executive action, allowing the president to act on his whims no matter how violent or lawless. The Senate actually tried to push back, and it's worth noting that the Senate narrowly failed to pass a measure that would have required congressional approval for the ongoing military strikes on boats, with 2 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski and Rand Paul, and all Senate Democrats voting in favor, which means this came perilously close to a bipartisan reassertion of congressional war powers. But it failed, and Trump made his position abundantly clear when he told reporters at the White House, "I don't think we're necessarily going to ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. We're going to kill them, they're going to be like dead. Read that statement again and understand what you're looking at, because this is not the language of constitutional governance. This is the language of autocracy. This is a president openly declaring his intention to kill people without congressional authorization, without judicial review, without any of the procedural safeguards that distinguish a republic from a dictatorship, and legal experts note that non-combatants do not become lawful targets by presidential declaration alone. The administration has tried to shoehorn this campaign into the framework of the war on terror by deploying terms such as narco-terrorists and designated terrorist organizations, with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth referring to these DTOs as the Al-Qaeda of the Western Hemisphere. But the United States suffered an armed attack on 9/11, which under international law gave it a right to self-defense recognized by the UN Security Council, whereas the United States has endured no similar attack to prompt this year's maritime strikes, and neither the UN Security Council nor the broader international community has recognized the United States' need to use lethal military force. This isn't counterterrorism. This is the executive branch unilaterally deciding that certain categories of crime now justify summary execution without trial, and if Congress allows this precedent to stand, then future presidents will cite that silence as practical permission to treat new categories of transnational criminal violence as open-ended hostilities under Article 2. The human cost of this policy is being borne by people who have names and families and stories even if the administration refuses to acknowledge their humanity. The drug runners at sea are often between 15 and 24 years old, and the cartel leadership views them as expendable, according to Rahul Gupta, with young people being recruited to do these runs for 100 bals, 500 bals. These are not the masterminds of international drug trafficking. These are desperate young people from impoverished communities being exploited by criminal networks, and the United States is killing them with Hellfire missiles launched from helicopters and drones as if they were enemy combatants in a declared war zone, and we're not even capturing intelligence from these operations because former military and law enforcement officials say the lethal strikes deprive the United States of valuable intelligence about cartel networks. Every boat that gets blown up is a lost opportunity to interrogate survivors, to trace financial networks, to understand trafficking routes and organizational structures. But that kind of patient, intelligence-driven law enforcement doesn't satisfy Trump's need for spectacular displays of violence that he can post on Truth Social with dramatic explosion footage. Meanwhile, the actual national security threats that could fundamentally alter the balance of global power are being either ignored or actively exacerbated by this administration's incoherent approach to strategic competition, and Kamlager-Dove identified this with laser precision when she pointed out that the real national security threat is selling AI chips to China, not blowing up fishermen in the Caribbean. The juxtaposition here is as revealing as the Hernandez pardon, because while Trump is conducting a military campaign in the Caribbean that has killed more than 80 alleged drug runners according to officials, his administration has simultaneously announced on social media that the U.S. semiconductor giant NVIDIA could sell advanced H200 AI chips to approved customers in China, so long as the U.S. gets a 25% cut of the revenues. This is not hyperbole or partisan spin. These are the actual policies being implemented by the same administration at the same time. The Trump administration knows that China gaining access to the chips which have previously been subject to export restrictions poses a serious threat to our technological leadership and national security. According to Senator Warren, the strategic implications are genuinely frightening because advanced AI compute is essential to the AI era, enabling both economic dynamism and novel military capabilities, making denying foreign adversaries access to this resource a matter of both geostrategic competition and national security, according to the president's own AI action plan. Yet Trump is willing to compromise that strategic advantage for a percentage of NVIDIA's sales revenue, while simultaneously claiming that killing young men on speedboats is vital to American security. China is pursuing AI dominance as a core national objective, with Xi Jinping urging nationwide mobilization to achieve self-reliance and self-strengthening in the technology by building an independent and controllable ecosystem. Pumpet and every advanced chip we sell them accelerates their progress toward military AI applications that could fundamentally alter the future of warfare, but Trump sees this as a business opportunity rather than a national security crisis. The priorities are completely inverted. Real threats are being monetized, performative threats are being militarized, and the American people are being sold a narrative that has no relationship to strategic reality. What we're witnessing is the hollowing out of constitutional governance in real time, and the consolidation of what legal scholars are calling unconstrained presidential power to use lethal force, Human rights advocates and several members of Congress expressed concern that the strikes could amount to unlawful or extrajudicial killings, noting the absence of public justification or congressional authorization. The ACLU and other civil liberties organizations have filed a lawsuit seeking the immediate release of an Office of Legal Counsel opinion and other documents related to the Trump administration's lethal strikes on civilian boats in international waters, because the administration is operating based on classified legal opinions that the public cannot scrutinize, which is exactly the kind of secret law that the War Powers Resolution was designed to prevent. According to the New York Times, specialists in the laws of war and executive power stated that Trump had used the military in a way that had no clear legal precedent or basis, and no evidence that vessels were carrying drugs was provided in many cases, which means people are being killed based on intelligence assessments that cannot be verified or challenged, because the targets are dead, and the survivors, when there are any, are immediately deported to prevent them from contesting their detention in court. This last point is particularly chilling, and it reveals the administration's consciousness of guilt about these operations, because the 2 survivors from one vessel, who Trump identifies as terrorists, were released to Colombia and Ecuador within hours, a move that prevents them from protesting their detention in court. Think about the implications of that procedure. The administration claims these people are dangerous narco-terrorists affiliated with designated terrorist organizations who pose such a grave threat to American security that we had to kill their companions without trial, but then the moment they're in custody, we rush them out of U.S. jurisdiction as quickly as possible to prevent them from accessing American courts. Because if they actually had access to habeas corpus proceedings or criminal trials, the entire legal justification for these strikes might be exposed as fraudulent. This is not how you handle genuine national security threats. This is how you cover up extrajudicial killings that cannot withstand legal scrutiny, and there's even reporting that, according to the Washington Post citing 2 sources with direct knowledge, 2 men who survived the initial strike were killed in a second strike, with Trump administration press secretary Caroline Leavitt confirming that the second strike had occurred. We are executing survivors to eliminate witnesses, and if that doesn't send a chill down your spine, then you haven't been paying attention to how authoritarian regimes consolidate power. The geopolitical ramifications extend far beyond the immediate body count, because the United Kingdom is withholding some intelligence from the U.S. over concerns about the legality of the strikes, according to sources, which means our closest intelligence-sharing ally has determined that these operations are so legally dubious that they cannot risk complicity. Colombian President Gustavo Petro called President Donald Trump a barbarian for this barrage of attacks, telling NBC News that the U.S. positioning in the Caribbean is undoubtedly an aggression against Latin America. We are alienating regional partners, violating international law, undermining intelligence cooperation with allies, and destroying any remaining credibility the United States might have had to criticize human rights abuses by other governments. Because how exactly do we condemn extrajudicial killings by authoritarian regimes when we're conducting them ourselves in international waters against people who have never been charged with crimes? Colombian President Petro addressed the UN General Assembly to call for a criminal process to be opened against Donald Trump for U.S. strikes in the Caribbean, and while that's unlikely to result in actual prosecution, it represents a catastrophic collapse of American soft power and moral authority in the hemisphere. The broader pattern here is unmistakable, and it's the pattern of a president who views military force as a personal prerogative to be deployed at will without congressional authorization, without public justification, without regard for international law or constitutional constraints, and who reserves the right to grant clemency to the most serious drug traffickers when they happen to be politically useful, while ordering summary execution for unnamed individuals who might be involved in trafficking. This is not the rule of law, this is the rule of Trump, and the progression is following a well-worn authoritarian playbook because, in public statements, the administration has applied the same terrorist label it uses for the victims of its boat strikes to immigrants and domestic political opponents, raising the prospect that Trump could use his supposed license to kill within U.S. borders. Once you establish the precedent that the president can unilaterally designate categories of people as terrorists and then order their execution without trial, the limiting principle disappears, and we have already seen Trump and his allies describe American citizens protesting his policies as terrorists, describe journalists investigating his administration as enemies of the state, describe political opponents as traitors worthy of military tribunals. The constitutional crisis is here. It is not theoretical. It is not hypothetical. It is happening right now in Caribbean waters where, after 10 weeks of striking suspected drug-carrying boats that killed at least 80 people, the Trump administration's Caribbean campaign, appears to enter a new phase with the arrival of the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, and the United States and Venezuela teeter on the brink of war with the Secretary of Defense announcing Operation Southern Spear to defend our homeland and remove narco-terrorists from our hemisphere. We are building toward a potential military conflict with Venezuela that Congress has not authorized, that serves no clear American interest, that will likely result in massive casualties and regional instability, and that is being justified by the same administration that just pardoned one of the world's most notorious cocaine traffickers. And if you think this is sustainable or compatible with democratic governance, then you have not been studying how republics collapse under the weight of executive overreach. What Kamlager-Dove articulated in that chamber was not partisan point scoring. It was a desperate attempt to arrest the slide toward unconstrained presidential war-making before the precedents become irreversible, because once Congress acquiesces to this expansion of executive power, it will be almost impossible to claw it back. The question before us is simple, and it admits of no equivocation. Do we live under a constitution that constrains presidential power and requires congressional authorization for military operations? Or do we live under a system where the president can kill anyone anywhere he designates as a threat? The Trump administration has chosen the latter, and they are daring Congress to stop them, and so far Congress has largely failed that test. Every day that passes without a successful war powers resolution, without defunding these operations, without impeachment proceedings for unconstitutional military action, is another day that the precedent hardens and the constitutional order erodes. This is how democracies die, not with a bang, but with the systematic normalization of executive lawlessness wrapped in the rhetoric of security, and future historians, if there are any who remain free to write honest history, will look back at this moment and ask why we didn't sound the alarm louder, while there was still time to arrest the descent into presidential authoritarianism that makes a mockery of due process and treats human lives as disposable props in a performative security theater designed to satisfy one man's authoritarian pathologies.